Today's session is entitled Subnational Diplomacy, Examples from China and Japan. For those of you who have attended our webinars before, welcome back. And for those who are new to the USAI Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Earls, and I am Program Manager at USAI. For background, USAI is a nonpartisan United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 45-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the US and Asia. Before we begin, all attendees should be aware that today's event will be on the record, recorded, and uploaded to the USAI YouTube channel. We ask that you please remain muted and keep your camera turned off throughout the speaker presentations. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to type it in the chat box or wait and share your question during the Q&A session at the end. Now, moving on to today's program, I would like to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Dr. Siwon Byun. Dr. Byun is Associate Professor of International Relations at San Francisco State University. Her research and teaching focus on the politics of China, international relations of East Asia, and international relations theory. Her research examines China's political economy and global integration, interdependence and security in Asia, and national identity politics in Asian relations. You can read more about her and all of today's panelists on our webinar webpage or the invitation. And we are very fortunate to have her with us today. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Siwon to begin today's session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from San Francisco. Thank you to the US Asia Institute for hosting this event as part of its Northeast Asia series. Today's webinar is on what I would say is one of the most important topics on the international relations of Asia, subnational diplomacy, and its implications for US, Asia, and Asian regional relations. Our two presentations focus on the US-China case and Japan's case from the perspective of Okinawa. So before introducing our three excellent speakers on this topic, I'll set up the discussion with some broader points on why subnational diplomacy matters in Asian relations. First, today's subnational cases draw attention to the more multi-layered forces of regional diplomacy than typically captured at the interstate level. An example last year is Governor Newsom's visit to China, focused largely on environmental cooperation just before California hosted the APEC summit here in San Francisco. Also last year, Okinawa Governor Denny Tamaki visited the United States to discuss US military base issues and visited China to promote economic and cultural cooperation. So these examples provide a fuller picture of the range of policy preferences and strategies shaping Asian regional relations that is best understood from the local level. Second, from a historical perspective, bottom-up processes of interaction driven by local, state, and societal exchanges have catalyzed higher-level diplomatic engagement. An example from the US-China case is ping-pong diplomacy's role in US-China normalization, which students from the University of Virginia revisited just last January through their sports exchange with Chinese counterparts in Beijing and Shanghai. And in China's economic diplomacy with Asian neighbors, cross-border development initiatives can be traced to the external strategies of local leaders and businesses in the Northeast border regions. So these historical patterns of regional diplomacy raise into question the current relationship between subnational and higher levels of interstate diplomacy and the points of convergence or divergence between bottom-up and top-down processes of engagement. Then to frame current US-Asia relations, we can identify 3 points of debate on the role of subnational diplomacy. First is US-China competition and the implications for Japan and other regional partners that share important interests with both powers. Second is the relationship between economic and political priorities especially given the growing linkages between regional economic and security initiatives, most notably in the high technology sectors. And a third point under this shifting geopolitical environment is the overall downturn in mutual public perceptions in China's relations with the United States and Asian allies, as shown by various opinion polls in recent years, at least at the national levels. So these recent trends reinforce enduring questions about expanding regional cooperation from local to higher government levels and from economic and cultural to other functional interests. So with those themes in mind, I'm happy to introduce our three speakers. First, we have Dr. Kyle Jarras. Dr. Jarras is Associate Professor of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. He is also currently the Truman Center's Visiting Senior Fellow for US-China Subnational Relations. Dr. Jarras's research focuses on China's urban and regional development, central-local relations, and subnational diplomacy. Dr. Jarras will speak to us today on US-China subnational diplomacy and its implications for bilateral relations. Our second speaker is Mr. Kazuyuki Nakazato. Mr. Nakazato is the director of the Okinawa Prefectural Government's Washington, D.C. office. Over his 25 plus years of experience with the Okinawa government, he has also managed the prefecture's tourism and development initiatives in Okinawa and Asia, and has served as the director of Okinawa's Shanghai Representative Office. Mr. Nakazato will speak on the policy initiatives of Okinawa and its DC office and their importance to Okinawa's interests. Our third speaker is Mr. Katsuya Tamaki. Mr. Tamaki is the Deputy Director of the Okinawa government's Washington, D.C. office. He was previously the head of tourism promotion in the prefectural government's tourism promotion division and was director of Okinawa Singapore Representative Office. Mr. Tamaki will join our Q&A session after the two main presentations. So with those introductions, let's start with our first presentation on the US-China case. Dr. Jarras.
All right, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Byun, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to take part in this webinar, and thanks to the other participants who I look forward to interacting with. So I'm very excited to have the chance to think through some of these issues, which are important and also rapidly evolving, with interlocutors who are coming from several different perspectives, focusing on different parts of East Asia, coming from different national backgrounds, and thinking about these really important topics in different ways. So my own perspective here and what I'm hoping to contribute looks at US-China subnational relations, the relations between US states and localities and Chinese official counterparts in the contemporary period. There's obviously a long historical backstory here as well, which I'm not planning to delve into too much now. But in my brief comments today, I want to first call attention to some important but unresolved questions about the role that subnational actors are playing here. And I think Dr. Byun has already highlighted and framed well some of these questions. Second, I want to just share some preliminary findings or answers to some of these questions that are emerging from the research that I'm currently doing with my co-author and Truman Center co-visiting senior fellow, Dr. Sarah Newland from Smith College. And then third, I just want to highlight a few key takeaways for policymakers and the broader public, still, I think, framed at a fairly broad level. So to start, I think it's, I don't need to say much in terms of motivating the importance of the US-China relationship right now. Obviously, this is a central foreign policy concern for the US, and it's a central matter of international affairs for countries around the world. This is a very difficult relationship right now, but it's also a very multifaceted one. And a lot of us from a lot of different angles are trying to understand how this very complicated competition and in some ways rivalry and in some domains perhaps conflict between the US and China can be managed peacefully, and how the interests of both countries can be advanced, and also how the interests of the world more broadly can be advanced in the midst of this kind of competition. So that's obviously the setting that we're thinking about some of these issues from when we're looking at the subnational relationship between the US and China today. But it's also important to look back over the past few decades to highlight the fact that as the US and China did build very strong economic, social, educational, and diplomatic ties over the last several decades, US states and localities were very much at the forefront of many of those exchanges and interactions and many of the linkages that were created. So this applies to the economic realm, the cultural realm, as well as political exchanges. US states and cities have built extensive business and trading relationships with Chinese counterparts. They forged extensive educational and scientific links. They promoted cultural and people-to-people exchanges over many decades. And there have also been many states and many localities across the US that engaged with official and non-official counterparts from the PRC on challenges such as climate change, the energy transition, environmental protection, and so forth. And of course, accompanying all of this, there's been a lot of high-level, paradiplomacy or subnational diplomacy, with exchanges of leaders, with partnering of cities as sister cities, friendship cities, partnering of states in similar ways, delegations going back and forth. So there's been a lot of activity on this front. Now, those who are sort of optimistic about this current difficult moment in the US-China relationship look to these ties that have been established between states and cities across the US over the past few decades as a source perhaps of ballast in the relationship, during this very topsy-turvy moment. They think that the kind of pragmatic logics and cooperation that have prevailed at the subnational level perhaps could be a balm to some of the tensions that have existed at the national level, maybe can ease some of the conflict or the logic of zero-sum competition that seems to have set in at the national level between the US and China. But what's important to acknowledge, of course, in dealing with this issue, frankly, is that the subnational ties between the US and China have also increasingly come under scrutiny in recent years, just as a political reality across the US. So subnational contacts and cooperation that once were seen as uncontroversial in many ways are now in various instances seen, at least by some observers, as touching on national security concerns or concerns that relate to the core economic competitiveness of these two countries. So things that previously we would perhaps relegate to the bucket of low politics are now much more tightly kind of wedded to issues of high politics, right? So we see this when we see how, now concerns about things like Chinese foreign direct investment in agriculture in the US, or, the establishment of manufacturing linkages, or even university links and exchanges with China are now much more politicized and in some ways much more securitized than before. And so this has created a real challenge. So because of these developments, I think pessimistic observers could say that the subnational relationships that have existed between the US and China are now becoming captive to the same kinds of logics and same forces that are determining the sort of bilateral, interstate relationship. These same aspects of competition, economically, geopolitical rivalry, ideological, dissonance. So the question that many of us are struggling with, and that my co-author Sarah and I are looking at in our research, really is the optimistic or pessimistic interpretation right here? So the research that I'm doing with Dr. Newland at Smith College is looking at recent trends in state and local relations between the US, China, and Taiwan, and considering the prospects at this moment for constructive US-China subnational engagement, as well as some of the risks and challenges of that. So we think that tracking the evolution of this subnational US-China relationship can both shed light on a key part of the US-China relationship, and it can also offer broader insights into both the possibilities and the limitations of subnational foreign engagement during periods of rising geopolitical tension, such as the period that we're currently living in. Just to give a brief overview of sort of the approach we take in our research and some of our preliminary findings, and I'm happy to go into any of this in more detail in Q&A if there's interest. We're drawing on both quantitative and qualitative data to track the changing mix of what we're calling cooperation as well as confrontation in state and local level interactions between the US and China. And we're also trying to explore the causes and consequences of diverging state level relationships with China. The focus of our work is the period between 2012, a little over a decade ago, and the present, and that takes us from the height of kind of subnational engagement, when many US states and, including their governors, their mayors, state legislators were rushing to create ties with China, and vice versa, to this period at present where there's a lot more skepticism, at least on the US side, about subnational engagement. And there's, I think, continued interest on the Chinese side, but also shifting approaches. We're trying to build the most comprehensive quantitative data set yet, tracking interactions at the subnational level between US states and Chinese counterparts. both on the cooperative and confrontational sort of dimensions. So we're looking at things like visits by governors back and forth, agreements that are being formulated between the two sides, the maintenance of trade offices, as well as state level legislation that's being passed both in support of and in opposition to China, looking at actions taken by state executives and attorneys general and so forth. We're now seeing a broader range of actors and types of action related to the China relationship. We're also taking a sort of deep dive into particular case studies. So we're doing a significant qualitative portion to the work as well, looking at the stories of several states that have represented sort of diverging trajectories within the US-China relationship in recent years. So we're doing in-depth research on the cases of California, Florida, Indiana, as well as New Hampshire, drawing both on primary documents from these different states and extensive interview research that we're doing with practitioners of subnational diplomacy and various other stakeholders at the state and local level. So to give you a snapshot of some of the preliminary findings from our work at this point, I'd say that the research so far is calling attention to the richness, but also to some of the complexity or contradictions of what's really going on at the subnational level of the US-China relationship. To this point about the pessimistic interpretation of subnational US-China relations, there's no question that there's been some spillover from the sort of bad mood of the overall US-China relationship into the subnational space. So we find when we're tracking things like visits by governors from the US to China, or if we're looking at the passage of legislation or legislative resolutions in state houses across the US that single out and criticize China, these sort of indicators of cooperation have dropped over time on the whole, and indicators of confrontation have on the whole risen over time, especially since 2017. So that again shows that there hasn't been an ability to completely bypass the shifting national level tensions between the US and China. On the other hand, however, we find that a lot of cooperation, various forms of cooperation have still persisted, even despite these major hurdles in the national level relationships. And this suggests to us that the subnational level does not rigidly follow what's happening at the national level. It's certainly influenced by it, but it's not determined narrowly by it. I think more importantly and more to the point, we're seeing tremendous heterogeneity, a huge amount of difference across the US in the way that state and local level relationships with China are evolving. We're finding different combinations of cooperation and confrontation at the state level in different places. Some states have remained deeply involved in cooperating with China on economic matters, as well as on things such as climate cooperation. Dr. Bune already referenced the recent trip in late 2023 by Governor Gavin Newsom of California to China. That was really the tip of the iceberg when we think about the recent engagement between California and China, both on the climate issue specifically, but also more broadly in terms of its educational links, continued interest in trade and investment promotion between the two countries, at least in areas that are now deemed less sensitive from a national security standpoint. And so California, China contacts remain at a high level. In fact, in some ways, the last 6 to 8 months has been one of the busiest times we've seen historically in terms of the volume of subnational diplomacy and delegations going back and forth between China and the US and California specifically. But on the other hand, right, other states have gone in very different directions. Florida represents sort of the leading edge of anti-China sentiment at the state level under Governor Ron DeSantis and Attorney General Ashley Moody. Florida has put in place much more stringent restrictions on Florida's ability to do business with China, on universities' ability to maintain ties with China, even on the ease of academic travel by people like me, professors in Florida. I'm not in Florida, but my counterparts in Florida, their ability to travel to China is now in question because of changing state policies. And there are policies such as Florida's ban on the purchase of real estate, even residential real estate across most of the state by Chinese nationals that show an overt level of exclusion and what many perceive as xenophobia or racism toward Chinese residents in the state. So this is a much more extreme manifestation of kind of anti-China sentiment at the state level. We also see states like Indiana, where I'm currently based, which are continuing in many ways to have substantive cooperation with China, a significant amount of trade and economic engagement with China, but that have also seen a spike in confrontational action toward China and to some extent a kind of disengagement from paradiplomacy or subnational diplomacy that was more common in the past. So we're really seeing a mixed picture across different states. And more generally across the US, we're finding that what's interesting when we look at the state level is that these two things, kind of confrontational action and cooperative action that we might think of as just different ends of the same spectrum, are actually sort of functioning as different dimensions of engagement with China. So we see places where there's high cooperation and high confrontation. We see places where there's little cooperation and little confrontation. And then we see places like California and Florida where cooperation is very high on one hand, or where confrontation is very high, as in Florida. We're just beginning to try to understand better the causal drivers of these different outcomes, these different state level trajectories, and also how they matter, how they're factoring back into the larger US-China relationship. But I think a couple early findings are sort of worth highlighting. One thing is that there's not a straightforward story here in terms of one causal, factor driving these different outcomes. This is not just a story of partisanship. It's not just a red state, blue state story. There's a lot more nuance there. There are red states that have remained more engaged with China. There are blue states that have disengaged. So it's not simply that Republicans are driving the harder line policies and Democrats are promoting cooperation. It's certainly more nuanced than that. It's not just a story of economic linkages or export dependence on China. On the whole, states are likely to have stronger cooperative relationships if they also have these strong economic ties that China built up over the last couple of decades. But this is not a simple predictor of these outcomes either. And geography also is not a simple predictor. California is, of course, in a kind of league of its own in terms of its engagement with China. But this is not simply a West Coast, East Coast, or a heartland coastal divide. There's a much more nuanced sort of process happening here. So one thing that from our case study so far we're seeing is the huge amount of agency really that subnational leaders in the U.S. and China, especially governors, mayors, but also state legislators, attorneys general, have in the way they're conducting these relationships. So because foreign affairs is not a sort of standard or required part of the portfolio of a U.S. governor or a U.S. mayor, it's an area where there's a lot of discretion to either play up this approach or to sort of withdraw and reduce the amount of activity. And this means that there's a lot of variation that seems to be driven by some of the choices that these political actors are making. We also, of course, see a very complicated interplay between federal policies and state level policies. In the first instance, we've seen federal policies and the harder approach toward China, the securitization of economic issues, the economic relationship with China trickle down to the state level. But now we're also seeing states that are taking much more aggressive measures toward China than the federal government. And there's a question of whether states now that have done this, like Florida, are going to be seen as sort of laboratories for a harder federal line, or whether the federal government will learn from potential overreactions at the state level and calibrate their policies more carefully. Okay, so to wrap up, there are three things that I want to highlight very briefly in wrapping up, right? The first part I think is obvious, and it's already spoken to by the subject of this panel. This is an important domain of the US-China relationship, and indeed of engagement in international relations in East Asia more broadly. And so it's critical that we take these subnational aspects of foreign affairs seriously and devote adequate resources to understanding and managing them, both to address potential risks, but also to take advantage of constructive opportunities where they exist. This is a distinctive part in the US-China relationship that doesn't simply operate according to the same logics that Washington, D.C.'s relationship with Beijing operate according to. It's clear that China, Beijing, is highly prioritizing the subnational level of the relationship with the United States. It's not always clear that the United States is bringing a seriously or a comparably kind of thoughtful game to the court. And so we need to see continued investment by the federal government, as well as efforts by state and local officials to really equip themselves with the knowledge and the organizational capacity to manage the subnational relationship. One start to this would just be continuing to fund things like the Subnational Diplomacy Unit, that exists currently within the State Department, but even that is something whose future is uncertain at this moment. We also need to see a lot more communication and coordination across different states and localities and between the federal government and subnational actors. Right now, there's a lot of reinventing of the wheel at the state level that's taking place, and we're also seeing a patchwork of national security related state legislation. So states that are taking it onto themselves to deal with what they perceive as national security threats. But this risks, states that do not have the same resources as the federal government trying to make determinations about what is or is not a threat, for example, to military infrastructure or other critical civilian infrastructure. And it also risks kind of overshooting the mark in some cases, as I would argue the Florida policies have done. So it's important that states and localities coordinate with one another, exchange best practices, but it's also really important that there's a clear division of labor between the federal government and states so that both actors are playing the roles that they can play most effectively. Finally, it's really important that we approach this question of the risks that have emerged in subnational US-China relations, which have received so much attention of late because of concerns about issues like espionage or concerns about undue political influence, that these concerns, where they exist, be addressed through targeted rhetoric and targeted measures rather than blanket statements and brute force measures. When we use kind of blanket China bashing rhetoric, we really risk inflaming anti-Asian hate. We risk creating an atmosphere of paranoia and fear in which it's hard to make good policies that actually weigh the benefits and costs of different actions. And when we adopt brute force measures instead of targeted measures, there's also a risk of real collateral damage. So if we shut down universities' ability to have relationships with China, we're not simply protecting US academia from Chinese influence, we're actually cutting off the US universities from a lot of the talent and increasingly from a lot of the key scholarship that they're going to need to thrive in this century, where the US is not the undisputed leader anymore in many scientific fields, but where there's a lot of international competition. And it's also really tricky to disentangle the sort of more problematic strands of these subnational relationships from the more positive strands, and therefore approaching this in a much more surgical way is necessary across the board. So I will stop here, but I look forward to hearing from our counterparts from Okinawa and a very different angle on the US-China relationship and the China-Japan relationship. And then I look forward to any Q&A or discussion after that.
Thank you, Dr. Jars. Mr. Nakazato?
Okay, I say hello. I'd like to thank US-Asia Institute for having us on today's webinar. I'd like to put up my presentation slide. Just a moment, please. Can you see the slide? Okay. So my name is Kazuyuki Nakazato. I'm the director of Okinawa Prefecture DC office. My colleague Katsuya Tamaki will join the discussion later. It is our great pleasure to introduce Okinawa and our subnational initiatives. So this is the agenda of my presentation. First, I will start with the introduction of our office. Then I will briefly explain Okinawa's location, unique nature, culture, and history. I also have to touch upon the contemporary issues we face in Okinawa to understand today's topics better. And finally, I will explain why it is essential for us, Okinawa, to promote policies and activities regarding subnational diplomacy. I sincerely hope that people attending today's webinar understand the situation in Okinawa. And also, I look forward to discussing subnational diplomacy through today's webinar and connecting with you all. Before getting into today's main topic, allow me to provide a brief introduction to our office. Having an office in Washington, D.C. is not very common for Japanese local government. Established in 2015, our office was spent past 9 years fostering dialogue between Okinawa and the United States on a wide range of topics. These include discussion on issues such as the presence of US bases in Okinawa. We also play a role in accurately conveying the position of prefecture government on various matters to the US government, Congress, think tanks, scholars, and American youth. In addition to our daily discussion with stakeholders, our activities include organizing visits by the governor to DC and other US cities, and planning and hosting symposium, webinars, and much more. Through our extensive networking efforts, we aim to deepen mutual understanding of these issues and strive to develop better solutions through collaborative discussions. Furthermore, we actively promote Okinawan culture, tourism, and products through various events. So many of the participants may already know about Okinawa, but please allow me to quickly introduce it. Okinawa is located at the southernmost tip of Japan, lying the center of East Asia, and in the middle of vast island chain. The population is about approximately 1.45 million. The size of all the islands combined is about 80% of the size of Rhode Island. Our main industries are tourism, IT, agriculture, and trade. With natural and cultural attractions and various other charms, Okinawa is now one of the most popular tourist destinations in Japan. Before the pandemic, over 10 million tourists visited Okinawa per year from mainland Japan and various countries, especially from East Asia. The prefecture consists of 160 islands, 47 of which are inhabited, stretching 620 miles from east to west and 250 miles from north to south. Yonaguni Island, the westernmost island of Okinawa, is only 70 miles away from Taiwan. As I mentioned, Okinawa's economy was booming in the pre-pandemic era, mainly thanks to tourism, and still have even more potential by taking full advantage of the fact that the islands are favorably situated in the center of East Asia and Japan. So Okinawa is home to the only subtropical climate found in Japan. The islands of Okinawa are known for beautiful beach resorts and abundant nature, such as coral reefs and unique wildlife. In 2021, UNESCO announced the addition to the natural site in Okinawa and neighboring islands in the World Heritage List in recognition of their high biodiversity value. So in the past, Okinawa was an independent state known as the Ryukyu Kingdom. Through commerce and interaction with our neighbors, the people of Okinawa created a unique and original culture by absorbing and adapting various and diverse influences. We often call our culture the Champlu culture. It's a mixed culture. Okinawa is the birthplace of karate, an Okinawan liquor called awamori, and Okinawan opera, it's like a kabuki called kumiudori, and Okinawan musical instrument called sanshin. They all have some influences from our neighbors. Okinawa is also known for its high concentration of centenarians. It is one of the 5 blue zones of longevity in the world. Researchers attribute the long life of Okinawan people to a spare diet that older generations are used to, and slow and happy lifestyle in which they are well connected with family and other community members. We call it ikigai, or purpose of life. There are many physically and mentally active senior citizens in Okinawa. So when we think about the current situation of Okinawa in the context of regional security, as well as the policies and activities of our government, it is important to understand the unique history of Okinawa. These are some of the epic moments in our history you may need to understand. In 605, Ryukyu first mentioned in Chinese history. For about 450 years from its establishment in 1429 until incorporation as a prefecture of Japan in 1879, Okinawa was an independent state called Ryukyu Kingdom. Ryukyu Kingdom flourished through vibrant trade and lively contacts with neighboring countries. The kingdom acted literally as a bridge of nations. After the Satsuma clan's invasion in 1609, Satsuma clan is in southern part of Kyushu region in Japan. The kingdom was in power of both China and Japan. The kingdom sent large delegations to Tokyo 18 times during the Edo period between the 17th and 19th centuries. The picture of 5 men in kimono was the last delegation before the kingdom's annexation. Commodore Perry visited Ryukyu 5 times. In 1854, the kingdom signed a treaty with the United States, similar to one that the United States signed with Japan the same year. But the kingdom was annexed into Japan in 1879. We also call the event Ryukyu Disposition. Okinawa's geological location has brought challenges throughout its history. Once the independent kingdom of Ryukyus, Okinawa went through annexation and assimilation into Japan, and decades after becoming part of Japan, the people of Okinawa were thrown into flames of a major international war. During the Battle of Okinawa in World War II, fierce battles between Japan and the US and Allied forces took place on the islands. People describe it as the typhoon of steel. It is reduced to the islands to ashes. In the end, the Battle of Okinawa resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people in both sides. Over 120,000 Okinawans lost their lives, including 94,000 civilians. This means that 1 out of every 4 Okinawans were killed in that war. 14,000 American soldiers also lost their lives. Through all these tragic experiences, the people of Okinawa have come to appreciate and value peace, pledging that such a tragic war should never take place again. After the war ended, Japan was occupied by Allied forces led by the United States, and in 1952, Japan regained its independence as a sovereign state. But Okinawa was separated from the Japanese administration and placed under US military government. Okinawa finally returned to mainland Japan in 1972. So now let's look at Okinawa today. There are 31 military installations exclusively used by US military, which is approximately 71 square miles, which is slightly larger than Washington, D.C., 68 square miles. About 15% of the main island of Okinawa is used for US military bases. And this means that 70.3% of all the US exclusively military use in Japan are concentrated in Okinawa, a small prefecture that accounts for merely 0.6% of total land area of Japan. The bases were first built during the US military occupation using the land requisitioned by the residents while the residents were in internment camps. And then after the residents returned, more land was seized to expand the bases. The process is often referred to as bayonets and bulldozers for its cohesive nature. When we think about the US military issues in Okinawa, I must emphasize that Okinawa prefectural government understands that Japan-US relations, including the bilateral security arrangements, have long contributed to peace and stability of Japan and East Asia. We also recognize that the rise of China as a military power has made the regional security environment increasingly complex. But the impact of the US military presence is not just a statistic, it's a daily reality for the Okinawans. Because of the large US military presence on these small islands, we have seen numerous problems stemming from the military bases, and the Okinawans have long been calling for the reduction of the US military presence on Okinawa. These problems include noise pollution caused by US military aircraft, accidents and incidents caused by service members, and environmental pollution, to name just a few. Capitalizing on Okinawa's distinctive geological and historical context, Okinawa Prefecture is actively working towards establishing itself as a hub for peace building. By furthering international exchange and cooperation in various domains, the Okinawa Prefectural government is fortifying its framework and policies as a form of subnational diplomacy that complements diplomacy at the national level. Okinawa Prefecture aims to become a bridge of nations, contributing to stability and prosperity, just as it did during the era of Ryukyu Kingdom. So 3 main pillars are hub for global peace building, hub for co-creation of global business, and hub for international cooperation and contribution. The network that Okinawa has developed with overseas communities is crucial in implementing these initiatives. One key element is the network of the descendants of Okinawans who ventured abroad. Although initially driven by Okinawa's challenging economic conditions, these individuals have overcome hardships and established themselves in various regions. It is estimated that there are more than 420,000 Okinawan descendants actively contributing to countries worldwide. Of those, about 100,000 descendants in North America. Okinawa Prefecture has formed sister relationship with regions with which it has deep historical ties, including state of Hawaii, Fujian province in China, Santa Cruz in Bolivia, and Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil. In addition to our office in Washington, we have 7 offices across Asia working to promote tourism, Okinawan products, and business exchanges. We also have several external representatives stationed in Southeast Asia, Australia, and Europe. All these elements of our international network, from the Okinawan descendants to the sister relationships and the strategically placed offices, are expected to play a pivotal role in advancing Okinawa's subnational diplomacy efforts. This slide enumerates the specific initiatives currently underway. We are now strengthening regional, bilateral, and multilateral ties. The governor signed a memorandum of understanding with the Republic of Palau in 2021 to promote cooperation on challenges common to islands. And he visited the country last January to discuss with the nation's ministers specific areas of collaborations, such as fisheries, agriculture, and energy. Also, the governor visited Washington in last March to update policymakers and security experts in DC on Okinawa's US military base issues and views of the people of Okinawa on regional security amid rising tension over the Taiwan Strait. There, the governor emphasized the importance of engaging in peaceful dialogue and diplomacy instead of solely relying on military deterrence. Our governor and vice governor's active engagement in reciprocal visits is expected to strengthen this partnership further. Earlier this month, discussions have commenced regarding the creation of collaborative frameworks with regions such as Jeju province in South Korea and Hainan province in China. With the establishment of the division responsible for subnational diplomacy in April, this April, Okinawa Prefecture government will continue to strengthen our efforts to facilitate dialogue between regional players to create and sustain peace. Based on the lessons learned from our tragic war experiences, the people of Okinawa aspire to serve as a bridge between nations in the 21st century, just as our ancestors did in previous centuries. We look forward to creating peaceful and abundant Okinawa through the spirit of carving new era, global exchange, and mutual support. I hope we can expand our network and work closely together. Please get in touch with us if you are interested in our activities or wish to discuss subnational diplomacy further. Building peaceful and prosperous Okinawa by sharing new ideas and cooperation will lead into stability and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region and the world. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your question and further discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Nakazato. That was great. We are on schedule in terms of the time. I think both our speakers laid out well the importance of understanding Asian regional relations from subnational perspectives, given similarities between China and Japan as Asia's most influential powers, as well as their differences in terms of their domestic politics and the nature of their relationships with the United States. I want to start off the Q&A session with a question to each of the speakers to take a closer look at the relationship between local and central state interests within China and Japan, given their current national priorities. Dr. Jaros, I think you gave us a great close-up picture of US subnational perspectives in interaction with US national priorities, and especially the variation across US states from pessimistic to optimistic scenarios. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the Chinese side of the story, given your extensive work on this topic. So China's national development priorities in recent years emphasize domestic innovation and the coordination of China's regional development, directing coastal investment to the less developed inland regions to manage the widening gap in China's regional development. And this trend is part of the longer-term trajectory of China's development rather than just a response to external pressures. So to what extent do China's central government priorities constrain or enable local economic engagement with the United States, especially given the patterns of decentralization and re-centralization of decision-making power in China? For example, as shown by Governor Newsom's tour of China's coastal regions, China's economic diplomacy is still primarily led by coastal regions. Does this continuation of coastal-led economic diplomacy challenge Beijing's priorities of managing regional development at home, and in turn place certain limits on the development of US-China subnational diplomacy? Or do these big coastal players have more foreign policy autonomy? Would you interpret the relationship between local and central state strategies abroad as complementary or more competitive? And then maybe I can ask the question to Mr. Nakazato and Mr. Tamaki. At the Asian regional level, one of the biggest dilemmas facing China's neighbors is how to manage security ties with the United States and economic ties with China. And this dilemma has only grown with US-China competition in both security and economic fields. For example, just this year, we saw Japan and South Korea strengthen trilateral security cooperation with the United States, while at the same time seeking to revive their trilateral ties with China, also extending to the local level, as you highlighted in Okinawa's initiatives with Jeju and Hainan Islands. So how do these higher level trends in Japan's coordination of relations with the United States and China affect Okinawa's regional diplomacy, given the local political and economic interests with both powers? On the other hand, how can Okinawa shape the way Japan responds to current trends in US-China relations? So perhaps Dr. Jaros, you want to start off?
Thank you so much for the question. And there's a lot there, so I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer. I'm going to try to be brief just so we have plenty of time for discussion, but I would look forward to following up on these topics because I think there's so much to think about. So you highlighted in your question sort of two different dimensions that we need to think about, or two different axes. So there's the central local dimension where it's possible that the interests or priorities of Beijing and those of China's provinces and city leaders are not completely aligned. There's obviously a certain amount of alignment. The PRC has a highly centralized political structure, which is not news to anybody on this call. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that even though Beijing can constrain the behavior of its provinces and city leaders, that it can determine what those leaders wish for or what their own interests are perceived to be. So I think there's been, in terms of the central local dimension, I think there's been a lot of, in the last few years, a lot of alignment in what Beijing wants and what local governments want, kind of coming out of the COVID freeze, right? Beijing is eager to stabilize its relationship, at least its economic relationship with the US, and it views subnational governments in the US as, at least it has been viewing them as more receptive partners than Washington, D.C. I think what the Chinese government has learned is that there are a lot of states and cities in the US now that are also highly suspicious of overtures from China, whether at the central or subnational level. So this is not sort of clear sailing for the diplomatic effort of PRC to establish subnational ties in the US, but nevertheless, there are a lot of states and localities and constituencies subnationally within the US who prioritize a stable and functioning economic relationship. And so that's been one way on both sides to kind of restore some level of pragmatism. At the same time, whether or not there is sort of additional diplomatic interest by Beijing in kind of cultivating a base of support outside of Washington, D.C. to bring more pressure to bear on the government in D.C., there's also the fact that China's provinces and cities have their own reasons for this kind of engagement. There's been a flood of Chinese delegations, business delegations, official delegations coming to the US in the months following Xi Jinping's visit to the West Coast late last year. I don't think there would be that much enthusiasm for these kinds of visits unless localities themselves also perceived their own reasons for wanting to do this. Of course, they will respect the foreign policy directives of Xi Jinping, but they have their own reasons that are much more mundane for wanting to keep a good relationship with US states and cities, right, as well as with the US federal government, which is that their economies are struggling. Many provinces and cities across China are seeing extreme fiscal crises. They've seen slowing economic growth, particularly when we're talking about coastal provinces that rely very heavily on exports as a driver of their economies. They are eager to both preserve their existing export markets and to expand them further, but also desperate to bring in more foreign capital to the extent possible to enliven their economies. So part of this, of course, is tied to China's strategic industrial objectives to build cutting edge industries in some of the emerging industrial sectors. But part of this is much more bread and butter desire to make sure that investment is flowing and that local economies are moving and that jobs are created, right? China is dealing with severe unemployment challenges in many cities. So this is a much more mundane reason, and I think from the US standpoint, a less threatening reason why we are seeing such a flood of interest from Chinese subnational levels. I don't want to go into too much depth on the coastal inland question that you raised, except to say that it's true that I think a lot of the activity in terms of subnational engagement with the US comes out of coastal provinces like Jiangsu or Guangdong that are already very large, but these are certainly not the only places that are involved. And we also see large inland regions like Chongqing, like Shanxi province, home to Xi'an, and others that also have engaged a lot in this kind of outreach.
So regarding the question, it is very difficult to predict how the U.S.-China and China-Japan relations going to be. But certainly it's a great concern among Okinawans about Chinese activities in the regions. For instance, when former Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, China's military launched ballistic missiles, and it returned very close to Okinawa, and which there's a constant concern, anxiety among the fishery industry close to the Taiwan region. So that's why Okinawa Prefecture is trying to promote people-to-people exchange with China, not only China but also Taiwan and other regions, so that we can to create confidence buildings and keep dialogue continued. That's my kind of thoughts, and maybe yeah, you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, like my colleague said, I think the biggest concern or dilemma for Okinawa as a subnational diplomacy player with China is the mounting pressure or the mounting tension because of the U.S.-China relations, and that definitely affect the Japan-China relations, of course. And there are a lot of media reports about China, and it's not always positive, it's rather negative. So I think the 10, 15 years ago, the people of Okinawa had a good image about China, but now I don't really know that that's good image still persists in Okinawa because of all these reports or whatever happen, what happens in the region. But the the diplomacy, the Japanese diplomacy has a lot of like the categories to engagement, like security, international cooperation, trade, economic activities, soft power, and people exchanges. All these but among these, there are definitely the prefectures or the cities are good at engaging in some of these. So that's what the state or not or prefectures or cities has to play. So that way we can stop deterring relations with other countries. So that's something that the subnational diplomacy can play.
Thank you. I want to make sure that we fit in questions from the audience. So we have a question for Dr. Jarrus, going back to the US-China side. What are your takeaways from San Francisco Mayor London Breed's trip to China? So this is a question that I'm also interested in. I think just last month, there were a group of Bay Area mayors who visited China. Do you have any takeaways to share from those city level trips?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of quick observations. So certainly, the city level is also very important to recognize here as a really important level for this U.S.-China subnational relationship. In fact, when it comes to cities like San Francisco and LA, arguably there's as much activity concentrated in these cities, right, as there is in whole states in other parts of the U.S. San Francisco in particular is an extreme outlier in both the historical, and cultural ties to China, the strength of those ties, the durability, the complexity in many ways, because there are many different types of Asian American communities and even Chinese American communities and Taiwanese American communities present in San Francisco, right? So this is a city with a very complicated identity when we talk about the Asian population and cultural influences and political influences in it. But it's a city with very strong ties historically to China, and it also has very strong economic ties. And over the last 10 years, 20 years, right, those ties became very central to the city's economy. This is true as well if we're thinking about cities like Seattle or Los Angeles on the West Coast. San Francisco has benefited economically from a large amount of tourism from China. It's benefited from major investment by Chinese investors at the peak of outbound Chinese foreign direct investment about 10 years ago into sectors like real estate within the city. So San Francisco saw a huge sort of rising tide of economic benefits at the time when the U.S.-China relationship was on a sort of an easier setting, and when these kinds of subnational contacts were much less fraught. Now that they're a lot more complicated, it's really changed the economic outlook for a city like San Francisco. And COVID in particular had a huge impact on San Francisco economically by cutting off San Francisco from a lot of these trans-Pacific ties, at least people movements. What we're seeing is an effort by both China, Chinese partners, and also by San Francisco to restart this economic relationship. I think San Francisco is back now to about half the number of direct flights that it had prior to COVID between San Francisco International Airport and Beijing, and that's obviously important to the economic lifeblood of the city for tourism and business, travel. It's not in any way surprising that Mayor Breed has made this trip. Every Chinese mayor has gone to Shanghai since Dianne Feinstein established the first sister city relationship in 1980. So this is kind of back to the future in a way. But on the other hand, it's also clear, and I want to stress this, that San Francisco looks at the US-China economic relationship very differently than Washington, D.C. does. And cities like San Francisco feel that many of the policies that have come out of Washington, D.C. have done significant damage to local economic interests. Obviously, Washington, D.C. doesn't think that San Francisco should be in the driver's seat when it comes to the U.S., China policy, but it's important to recognize some real dissonance here, and the fact that China is certainly aware that there are constituencies within the U.S. that are much more open to trade and are thinking about China very differently than federal policymakers at this moment. And San Francisco is certainly a city that's just much more comfortable having that kind of close relationship culturally, economically, than a lot of the country is right now.
Thank you. That makes me feel lucky to be based in San Francisco. So I want to bring in a question. I think we have time for one more question from the audience to Mr. Nakazato and Mr. Tamaki. So Okinawa, this is sort of related to my earlier question. Okinawa has a unique history and ties with the United States and China, which might have a different position with the two countries compared to other prefectures. So can Okinawa and Governor Tamaki's model of proactive subnational diplomacy be applicable to other major prefectures in Japan in promoting subnational diplomacy?
So I think when I was in Shanghai, it's about more than 10 years ago, but other prefecture had Shanghai office. Like there were about 20 local governments as office in Shanghai. So it's a degree, but other prefectures are engaging somewhat at the subnational activities through like economic exchange. So I think we all can get hand in hand and cooperate each other. Not only Okinawa but other prefectures. They already have done the relationship with China, and I think many of them are ongoing. Like tourism promotion, people-to-people exchange. So I think that we definitely other prefectures can join and to even more subnational diplomacy.
Okay, so I think we need to wrap up here. I want to thank all three of our speakers and the US Asia Institute. We really appreciate Dr. Jaros's views based on his work on China's subnational diplomacy, as well as Mr. Nakazato and Mr. Tamaki's views, given their practical experience in Okinawa's case.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, thank you to Dr. Byun, Dr. Jaros, Nakazato-san, and Tamaki-san for being with us and speaking for this webinar today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of all of your busy schedules to share your perspectives and findings about this topic. And thank you as well to everybody who has tuned into this webinar. Finally, we'd also like to give a special thanks to USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. They are SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, Fairfield Maxwell, and Suntory. Although we're out of time, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with our speakers, please reach out to us and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the things we've discussed today. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you.